My name is Tessa Brandt, and I was 32 the spring my mother slid a single sheet of paper across her kitchen island and told me, without ever once raising her voice, that I'd made my choice and now I'd live in it. The paper was from her attorney. My mother is Diane Vance, of the Savannah Vances, and the letter removed me from the family trust in 2 clean paragraphs. She didn't shout. She just smoothed the granite with the flat of her hand and said, "It isn't personal, Tessa. It's about what this family is. You married a man who cooks other people's dinners for a living. People talk. I won't have it at my table." I didn't argue. I folded the page in half, then in half again, and slid it under the fruit bowl, where she kept the unopened mail. "Okay, Mom," I said. That was all I had for her. What she never asked, not that morning, not in the 11 years before it, was what Marcus actually did with the rest of his life, the part that didn't happen at our stove on Sunday mornings. She decided exactly who he was the first day she saw his apron, and she never updated the file. 14 months later, an engraved invitation to her gala landed in my mailbox. She had no idea she'd just invited the one person in that entire ballroom who could undo her with a single round of applause. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people keep their receipts and let the room do the talking. If a story like this has ever crept through your own family, leave a comment and hit subscribe before we start. It helps these stories reach the people who need them more than you'd think. There's a particular sound a heavy front door makes when it closes behind you in a house where you grew up but no longer belong. A soft, expensive click.
No Islam.
The Vance house on Gaston Street made that sound the morning my mother cut me off, and I heard it the whole drive home, long after I'd left it behind. But to make any of this land the way it landed on me, I have to take you back further than that morning. I have to take you to the part nobody in my family ever bothered to learn. I grew up the youngest of 3, in a house with a name. Not a nickname, a name, the way old Savannah houses have names, the way the family that owns them gets folded into the city's idea of itself. My grandfather built that. His name was August Vance, and everybody who was scared of him called him Mr. Vance, and everybody who loved him called him Gus. I called him Gus. He let me, and it drove my mother to distraction. Gus started with nothing. That's not a flourish. It's a fact she spent her whole adult life trying to smooth over. He started on the river docks loading freight at 16, and by the time he was 40, he owned the company the freight moved through, and by the time he was 60, he owned 3 more, and by the time I was old enough to sit on his porch with him, he owned half the things in town that mattered, and most of the people who thought they mattered owed him a favor. He wore the same 2 cardigans for a decade. He kept his money quiet. He used to tell me, "Tess, anybody who has to tell you they're rich is just renting it." My mother did not inherit that sentence. Diane Vance married my father, Gus's only son, and she took to the name like it was a costume she'd been waiting her whole life to wear. She learned the right charities, the right pew, the right way to hold a glass so the stem stayed cold and your hand stayed warm. She was good at it, I'll give her that, even now. She built a life out of being seen in the correct rooms next to the correct people, and she raised my older brother and sister to do the same. My sister, Caroline, married a man whose family owned a bank. My brother, Preston, runs the Vance Real Estate Holdings and golfs with the people who decide things. And then there was me, the one who, at family Christmases, was always quietly redirected away from the good seats. The one Gus used to wink at across the table when Diane was mid-sentence about somebody's renovation. I didn't want the rooms. That was the thing none of them could ever quite forgive. I went to the state school instead of the one with the ivy. I got my certification in special education, and I took a job at a public elementary on the west side of town working with kids who learned sideways, the way I always had. The pay was a joke. The work was the realest thing I'd ever touched. I had a boy named Dante who didn't speak for the first 4 months I knew him, and then one afternoon read me a whole page out loud, and I went out to my car afterward and sat there with my hands shaking on the wheel because some things are too big to hold standing up. My mother, when I told her about Dante, said, "That's lovely, sweetheart," in the voice she used for things she'd already stopped listening to. I met Marcus the year I turned 21, which means by the spring of the gala I'd been loving him for 11 years and married to him for 9. I met him in a diner. Not a charming retro diner, a real one, off the highway, the kind with a laminated menu and coffee that's been on the burner too long, and a cook you can see through a cutout in the wall. I'd been crying in a back booth over a boy who didn't deserve the salt, and the cook sent out a plate of eggs I hadn't ordered with a note tucked under the toast that said, "On the house. Whatever it is, eggs help." His handwriting was terrible. I went back the next morning to argue with him about the eggs, and we talked until his shift ended, and then we kept talking, and somewhere in there I stopped being a girl who cried over boys who didn't deserve the salt. Marcus was a line cook. He'd been a line cook since he was 15, when his mom got sick and somebody had to keep the lights on. He never finished high school in the normal way, got his diploma at night later, the long way around. He had burned scars up both forearms like a map of every kitchen he'd ever stood in. He could taste a sauce once and tell you the 4 things it was missing in the order you should add them. He was the calmest person I had ever been near, and being near him felt like the first time in my life I wasn't braced for something. I brought him home for Easter that first year. I want you to understand that I did it hopefully. I was young enough to still believe my family would meet a good man and see a good man. My mother shook his hand, looked at the burned scars, and said, "And what is it you do, Marcus?" And when he told her she did this thing with her face, it didn't fall, exactly. It went smooth. Smoother. Like a pond when the wind stops. And she said, "How interesting," and turned to ask my sister about the flowers.
Gus, though.
Gus walked Marcus out to the back porch after the meal, and they were gone an hour, and when they came back in, my grandfather had his hand on Marcus's shoulder, and he caught my eye across the room and gave me one slow nod. That nod meant more to me than my mother's entire face. Later, in the kitchen, Gus dried a dish and said to me low, "That boy listens with his whole body. You hang on to him." Then he said the thing I've carried ever since. "Your mother counts the wrong things, Tess. She always has. Don't you learn it from her?" Gus died the winter I turned 28. Quietly, in his sleep, in the same bed for 40 years. He left me 3 things, none of them money, because the money was all in the trust my mother administered, and the trust was a closed system she controlled with a smile. He left me his watch, a plain steel thing he'd worn since the docks, scratched to gray. He left me a wooden recipe box of my grandmother's handwritten cards, because he knew Marcus would treasure it more than anyone alive. And he left me a single short note, in that same cardigan and quiet way, that said only, *build something honest. Don't ask them to clap, *. I think about that note more than I think about almost anything. Here's the part my family genuinely did not know, and I want to be fair because some of it was their fault and some of it was just the way Marcus and I are built. Marcus had stopped being only a line cook years before. He'd taken a tiny failing breakfast place near the hospital. The owner was retiring, and Marcus bought it with money we'd scraped, and a loan he signed alone so my name wouldn't be on the risk. He worked it himself, 6 in the morning until close, and he made it good, and then he made it busy, and then he took what it earned and bought the struggling lunch place 2 doors down, and then the one across the river, and somewhere in those years the thing stopped being a couple of diners and started being a company with a name on the paperwork. Larkspur Hospitality Group. Larkspur because that was the street his mother lived on, the one he kept the lights on for at 15. By the spring of the Gala, Larkspur ran 14 restaurants across 3 states. Not flashy ones, neighborhood places, the kind a city actually loves, the kind that hire people other restaurants won't and pay them like the work is real. Marcus still wore an apron most days. He still got to the first kitchen before the sun. We lived in a 3-bedroom on a normal street with a dog named Biscuit and a mortgage we could have paid off and didn't because paying it off felt like bragging, and Gus had ruined us both for bragging. My family saw the apron. They never once asked what was behind it. Why would they? They'd filed Marcus under the cook on Easter 11 years earlier, and my mother does not reopen files. So that's the ground it all happened on. A grandfather who counted the right things and a mother who counted the wrong ones, and a man with burn scars and a recipe box who'd quietly built something honest and never once asked anybody to clap. Now let me tell you how my mother taught me, slowly and then all at once, exactly where she decided I belonged. It started small, the way these things always do. A wedding, my cousin Bitsy's, where Marcus and I were seated not at a family table, but at the one by the kitchen doors with the vendors and the plus ones nobody could place. My throat tightened when I saw the place card, but I told myself it was an oversight, and I let it go, and we had a perfectly nice time near the kitchen doors, where, frankly, the food came out hottest. Then it was the Christmas photo. The family does a portrait every year, professional, framed, sent to 400 people. The year after Gus died, the photographer set us up and my mother stepped in and rearranged everyone, and somehow when the shutter clicked, Marcus was a half step out of frame. She did it so smoothly, I didn't even catch it until the prince came. "Oh, these things happen," she said, when I called. "We'll get him in next year." We were not in next year's either. Then it was the dinners. The Hale's anniversary, the hospital board dinner, the little Sunday lunches that were the actual machinery of her world. The invitations would come addressed to Tessa and not Tessa and Marcus, and when I'd ask, she'd have a reasonable answer every single time. "It's a small table, sweetheart. I could only do one per family. It's really more of a business thing. You'd both be bored. Sally's doing the seating, and you know how she is about numbers." Always reasonable. Always something a normal, loving mother might actually say. That's the part that got under my skin and stayed there. She never gave me a villain I could point to. She gave me 1,000 small, plausible doors closing, and dared me to be the one who made a scene about a door. I want to be honest about my own part. For a long time I went along with it. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I told myself Marcus didn't care about her dinners, which was true, and that therefore it didn't matter, which was not. The kids at school had a word for what I was doing. They'd say someone was being small to fit. I was being small to fit a family that had already measured me and found me too large for the spot they'd assigned. The dinner where it cracked was at the house on Gaston, a Sunday, the spring before the disinheritance. Preston was there with his wife and Caroline and an aunt and 2 of my mother's friends from the foundation board, so there were witnesses, is what I'm saying. The room was not empty. Marcus had come with me because it was billed as family, and he'd brought a tart he'd made because he never shows up to anyone's house empty-handed. That's just who he is. My mother took the tart at the door and set it on the sideboard, and it never made it to the table. Over the meal, one of the foundation women asked Marcus, kindly enough, what he did, and before he could answer, my mother answered for him. "Marcus is in food service," she said, and gave a little laugh, and the table gave the little laugh back, and the conversation moved on like water around a stone. I watched my husband's hands go still on his napkin. He didn't say anything. He never says anything. But I felt the heat climb up my own neck, and under the table I put my hand on his knee, and he covered it with his, and that was the whole conversation we had about it. Afterward, in the car, I said, "I'm sorry." And he said the thing he always says, which is, "You don't owe me her." Then, after a minute, quietly, looking out the windshield, "But I think you owe yourself something better than that table." 2 weeks later, my mother called and asked me to come by just me in the morning. I should have known from just me. She had coffee out and the good cups, which was its own kind of warning. She let me get halfway through mine before she slid the paper across the island. The letter from the attorney. The 2 clean paragraphs removing me from the trust. I read it twice. The room seemed to tip a few degrees, and right itself. My hands went cold around the warm cup. And I looked up at my mother and asked her the only thing I wanted to know, which was, why now? And here is where, if this were a movie, she'd have said something monstrous. She didn't. That's the thing I need you to sit with. She set down her own cup, and she folded her hands, and she said, in the gentlest, most reasonable voice you have ever heard, "Because you've made it clear you're not going to leave him, and I've made my peace with that, I have. But I have to think about the family, Tessa, about what we are. I can't have the trust touched by a situation that doesn't reflect us. It isn't personal. It's a family decision. We talked about it." We. As though there'd been a vote. As though somewhere in this house the rest of them had raised their hands. I didn't cry, and I didn't beg. I'd love to tell you that was strength. Honestly, I think something behind my eyes just went flat, the way a screen goes dark. I folded the letter in half, then in half again, and I slid it under the fruit bowl where she keeps the mail, and I said, "Okay, Mom." And I picked up my purse and I left, and the heavy door made its soft, expensive click behind me, and I drove home with my pulse knocking in my ears the whole way. When I told Marcus, and I told him flat, no softening because we don't soften things for each other, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled me in, and I felt his chest rise and fall against my cheek, slow, like he was deciding something. And all he said into my hair was, "I understand." Not "I'll fix it," not "how dare she," just, "I understand." Like he'd been waiting 11 years for the file to be made official and was almost relieved the pretending was done. Then he said, "We're going to be fine, Tess." And we were. That's the part nobody warns you about, that you can be cut off from a family fortune and discover, in the cold quiet afterward, that you were already standing on ground of your own. 14 months passed. I want to be clear about that number because the silence inside, it was its own country. 14 months of no Sunday calls. 14 months of finding out about my niece's birthday party from a photo my sister posted. 14 months of Preston meaning to call. My mother and I did not speak. Not once. She is very good at the long quiet. She practically invented it. I didn't fall apart. I taught my kids. Dante moved up a reading level, and then another. Marcus opened the River District place, and let me name it. Biscuit got gray around the muzzle. We had a small, warm, full life that did not have my mother in it, and most days that subtraction felt like more than I'd lost. Most days. Then the invitation came. Heavy cream stock, engraved, the Vance crest my mother had quietly commissioned a decade earlier as though we'd come over on a boat. The Lowcountry Children's Hospital Foundation annual spring gala. My mother was chairing it, as she had for years. It was her signature, the jewel of her season. 300 guests in the ballroom of the old Cotton Exchange, a silent auction, a program, a speech. My name was on the inner envelope. Just my name. Of course. I held that invitation for a long time at my kitchen table. Biscuit put his chin on my foot. And I have to be straight with you about why I decided to go, because it would be a nicer story if I went out of grace, and grace isn't quite it. I went because something in me wanted to stand in that room one time as myself, not as the seat by the kitchen doors. Marcus came in from the garage, read it over my shoulder, and went very still in that way he has. "You want to go?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I think I need to," I said. He was quiet for a second. Then he did something he almost never does, a small, private smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, there and gone. "Then we'll go," he said. "Both of us." And he didn't explain the smile, and I didn't ask because I figured he was just being brave for me. I had no idea. I genuinely had no idea what he knew that I didn't. The night of the gala, the old Cotton Exchange was lit up gold from the inside, every window glowing, and the line of cars wrapped halfway down the block. I'd bought a dark green dress on sale, and Marcus wore the one good suit he owned, the one he keeps for funerals and the rare front-of-house night, and when he offered me his arm at the bottom of the steps my hands were not entirely steady. I won't pretend they were. We walked in, and the ballroom opened up the way those rooms do, chandeliers, a string quartet, 300 people who all somehow knew the same 600 people. And I felt the temperature of the room find me. You know the feeling. Heads turning a half-second too long. A little eddy of whispers moving away from us like ripples. My sister saw me from across the floor, and her smile froze on her face like frost on a window. My brother lifted his glass an inch in something that wasn't quite a greeting. And then, by the auction tables, I saw my mother. She saw me at the same moment. And for one heartbeat, I'll give her this. She's fast. For one heartbeat her composure slipped, and I saw the question move across her face. Why is she here, and who told her she could come? Then the chair of the gala armor went back on, and she crossed the room toward us with her hostess smile fixed in place, and she said, "Tessa, what a surprise." Her eyes flicked to Marcus and away, the way you'd glance at a coat rack. "And you brought your husband." She couldn't quite make herself say his name in that dress in that room. "His name is Marcus, Mom," I said, evenly. For words, give or take. That was all I had planned to spend. She gave a tight little laugh. "Of course." "Well, there's room at the back, near the service entrance. Sally can find you something." And she turned to greet a senator's wife, and the matter was, in her mind, closed. Filed. The seat by the kitchen doors, 11 years later, in a fancier building. We found the table near the service doors. Marcus held my chair. The lights came down for the program, and a hush moved over the room, and my mother glided up to the podium in front of 300 people to do the thing she was born to do. She was good. I'll keep being fair. She thanked the committee. She thanked the hospital. She talked about the children's wing and the families and the long road still ahead, and she had the room in her hand the way she always does. And then she got to the part of every gala speech where the chair thanks the people who paid for the evening, the underwriters, the title sponsor, the company whose gift makes the whole night possible. And finally, my mother said, glancing down at the card in her hand, the card someone on the committee had prepared for her, the card she clearly had not read closely in advance. None of tonight, not this room, not this meal, not a single dollar going to that wing, would have been possible without the extraordinary generosity of our title sponsor. They underwrote this entire evening. They donated every plate of food you've eaten tonight. And I'm told their founder is here with us. She smiled out at the room, gracious, expansive, the queen of her own season. Would the owner of Larkspur Hospitality Group please stand, so we can thank you properly? And the room turned to look. And beside me, my husband set down his napkin, the way he had at her dinner table a year and a half before, except this time, slowly, he stood up. I have replayed the next few seconds more times than I can count, and I still notice something new in them every time. The first thing was the sound. Not silence, applause. Real applause, immediate, the kind a room gives a person it already knows and respects. Because half that ballroom had eaten at Marcus's places for years. Half of them had hired Larkspur to cater their own weddings and wakes. The hospital president on the stage was clapping with his hands above his head. The senator's wife my mother had turned to greet was on her feet. People at the good tables, the family tables, were craning around and beaming and calling his name, Marcus, there he is, Marcus, like he was the one person they'd been hoping to see all night. And my mother stood at that podium with the gracious smile still fixed on her face and watched the man she'd called food service rise from the table by the service doors to a standing ovation in the center of her own season. I watched the smile stay up about 2 seconds too long, the way a held note goes wrong. I watched the color go out of her face from the top down, like someone slowly closing a curtain. Her hand found the edge of the podium and gripped it, knuckles going pale against the dark wood. The card with the sponsor's name on it trembled once in her other hand and went still. Her eyes came off Marcus and found me at the back table, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched my mother understand something faster than she wanted to. Marcus didn't milk it. That's not who he is. He gave the room a small wave to settle it down, and someone handed him a microphone, and he said, and his voice didn't shake, his voice never shakes, "Thank you. Larkspur's proud to be a part of tonight." The truth is most of us in that kitchen came up the hard way, and a children's hospital is the kind of place you want to stand behind when you remember being a kid yourself with nobody standing behind you. A murmur went through the room, warm. So, thank you for having us. Eat well. Give generously. That's the whole speech. The room laughed and clapped again and loved him, the way rooms do love a man with burned scars who feeds people and doesn't crow about it. And my mother had to stand up there and say, into the microphone, in front of 300 of the only people whose opinion she has ever organized her life around, thank you, Larkspur, for your extraordinary generosity. She had to thank him by the name of his company because I think the other name would have cost her something she didn't have left. Then she set the card down and stepped back from the podium and the program moved on. And Marcus sat down next to me and slid his hand over mine on the white tablecloth and leaned in close and said the only thing he said to me about it the whole night. I wasn't going to tell her at a dinner, he murmured. Felt better to let the room do it. I didn't gloat. I want to be honest that the feeling wasn't triumph, exactly. It was something quieter and stranger, a kind of stillness, like a sound I'd been bracing against for 11 years had finally stopped. I squeezed his hand. I looked at the back of my mother's head as she found her seat, and I felt, of all the things, a little sorry for her, which I did not expect and did not entirely want. We left before the dancing. We always do. We got the car from the valet and drove home with the windows down, and at a red light Marcus reached over and tucked a loose piece of hair behind my ear, And when we got in, I let Biscuit out and put the kettle on, and we sat at our own kitchen table in our own quiet house and drank tea, and that was the whole celebration. A cup of tea, the dog asleep on my feet, Marcus's hand around the back of my neck. Ordinary. It is amazing how much you can lose and how little, in the end, you turn out to need. The cascade started the next morning, and it didn't stop for weeks. The first call was my sister Caroline, who I hadn't heard from in 14 months. She was so glad I'd come. She said she'd been meaning to reach out. The kids asked about me all the time. She wondered, by the way, completely unrelated, whether Marcus did private events, because she was on the committee for the museum benefit, and they were desperate for someone with his vision. I told her Larkspur had an events line, and she could call the main office, like anyone else. There was a small pause on the line. She'd never had to be anyone else before. Then Preston, my brother, who got right to it the way he does. He'd been hearing things about Larkspur's expansion into the old riverfront warehouse district, which, coincidentally, was where the Vance Holdings had been sitting on a row of empty buildings nobody would lease for 3 years, slowly bleeding the family money. He wondered if Marcus might want to talk synergies. I said Marcus made those calls himself, and gave Preston the office number too. I will admit there was a small, warm, uncharitable part of me that enjoyed reading him that number off the back of a Larkspur takeout menu. The talk had moved through the city by then, the way talk does in a place like Savannah. The story wasn't Diane Vance chaired a lovely gala. The story was, did you hear Diane disinherited her own daughter over the man who turned out to be the biggest restaurateur in the Lowcountry? And that story has legs, and it ran. My mother's whole life is built on being the one who decides who's in and who's out, and overnight, she'd become the woman who'd put herself on the wrong side of her own door. Her foundation board, I heard later, was suddenly very interested in keeping Larkspur as a sponsor for next year, which meant being very interested in keeping Marcus happy, which meant my mother's signature event now quietly depended on the goodwill of the man she'd called food service at her own table. Nothing collapsed. Nobody went bankrupt. It was subtler and, I think, worse than that. She just stopped being the person who sets the terms, in the one arena she'd given her life to. She called last. Of course, she called last. She is always the last to do the thing that costs her. It was a Sunday morning, which I noticed because Sunday mornings used to be hers. I almost didn't pick up. Marcus was at the stove making the eggs he's made me on 1,000 Sunday mornings since the first plate with a terrible note, and Biscuit was waiting under his feet for something to drop, and the kitchen smelled like butter and coffee and our actual life. I stepped out onto the back porch to take it. She didn't lead with an apology. She's not capable of the clean kind. She led with, I think we got off on the wrong foot, you and I, these last couple of years. Couple of years. As though it had been weather. As though no one had slid a paper across a counter. And then, more quietly, in a reasonable voice, the one I'd know anywhere now, the one that had filed my husband under a category and closed the drawer, she said, why don't you and Marcus come for Sunday lunch? Both of you. I'll do the long table. The long table. The good table. 11 years, and a standing ovation late. I stood on my own back porch with the phone warm against my ear, and I looked through the window at my husband flipping eggs in an apron, and I thought about Gus drying a dish and telling me she counts the wrong things, and I thought about a note in terrible handwriting that said eggs help, and a note in my grandfather's hand that said don't ask them to clap. And I said, we're doing just fine where we are, Mom. For words and a little more. Steady. No heat in it. I wasn't trying to wound her. It was just true. There was a silence on the line that I let sit. I didn't fill it. I'd learned the long quiet from a master, and it turns out it works in both directions. Well, she said finally, and her voice had gone small in a way I'd never heard from her, a little tremble in it that steadied at the end the way they all do. The offer stands. If you change your mind. I know it does, I said gently, because I'm not made of stone and she's still my mother. Take care of yourself, Mom. And I hung up and I went back inside, and Marcus put a plate of eggs in front of me without a word, and I ate them at our table in the morning light, and the dog finally got his piece of toast. So here's what I keep coming back to, in case you're still with me. My mother spent her whole life counting the wrong things, and she taught all of us to count them too, and the only one who got out from under it was the one she pushed out the door. I didn't beat her. There was nothing to beat. The room did it. The truth did it. All I had to do was stop being small enough to fit the seat. She kept saving me by the kitchen doors. That's my story. A letter folded twice under a fruit bowl, a worn apron with burned scars stitched into the man who wears it, and a scratched steel watch that belonged to a dockworker who counted the right things and still, all these years later, keeps perfect time on my husband's wrist. Now I want to hear from you. If your own mother handed you a paper that erased you from the family, and then, 14 months later, found herself needing the one thing only your husband could give, would you have stood up at that gala? Or would you have stayed quiet in your seat by the kitchen doors? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.